Hey, if you have your Bibles, I want you to turn to the Old Testament book called Nehemiah. Nehemiah, and you can get that on your devices or whatever. We're going to go through basically verse by verse this summer in the book of Nehemiah. Now, this fits into our whole year-long emphasis on bold leadership and on bold living as much as anything. This is about leadership. And one of the things that I like about summer series is we can kind of park where we've been at and jump into something maybe in the Old Testament. And they're fairly easy to follow. So if you miss a week or here or there because of vacation or trip or travels, you should be able to join in fairly easily. And today we're starting with the book of Nehemiah. As we turn into the summer of 2018, we turned the page from spring and winter and from this emphasis in the book of Acts now into something more definitive about leadership especially. Acts has been our pattern for bold living. And yet, when we think about the book of Acts, and especially the first 15 chapters, we think about things like waiting, listening, integrity, speaking up at the right time, about decision-making, about bold praying, dealing with opposition and conflict, and dealing with organizational issues as well. All of those have come in the first 15 chapters of the book of Acts. And so I think it'd be a good moment here just for us to step back and ask ourselves the question. We are talking about living bold lives. So what act of boldness have you been involved in these last 6 months? What steps of boldness have you taken as a result of what you've learned from the book of Acts? Where can you identify there being some kind of move that you've made that took a little bit of boldness, or maybe some kind of place where somebody said, wow, now that was a bold move? And my hope is that this just isn't information. You know, the worry is the longer a preacher preaches at a place, the more what he preaches becomes noise. And the only defense against that just being noise is the fact that it is the Spirit of God that speaks into our hearts and not just somebody up on a stage. But you need to put it into action. And that's what we're going to see in Nehemiah. Somebody who was bold and somebody who really did believe that he needed to put it into action. Henry Blackaby, in his book called Experiencing God, says these words. This is the primary premise of the entire book. He says, the church needs to find out where God is already working and join him in it. And I had heard that, I've read the book, I've thought a lot about it, I've processed that over the years, and it makes more sense now than it ever has in my life, that the church needs to find out where God is already working and join him in it. That's a profound statement, especially because for generations upon generations, God has been working. God's been working. And you've heard me say this over and over, and I'll say it another 100 times probably, that the Bible really is one story from front to back. It's not a collection of stories. It's not a collection of fables. It's not a collection of disconnected and disjointed kind of things. It is a collection of one story, really one story from the very beginning in Genesis 1 all the way to Revelation chapter 22. It's the story of a gap. It's the story of a gap between God and man. It's a story of a gap between God and man that man created between him and God. And it's the story of an intense God who decides, I will do anything in order to bridge that gap, to pull it back together. And it's literally taken him generations to do that. And he continues to do it today. And he did it through Jesus Christ, who was, as John called, the perfect and sinless Lamb of God, the one who takes away the sins of the world. That's Jesus. But all along the way, we see the manifestation of this story unfolding in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. His statement makes sense from a practical point of view as well. Blackaby is saying starting anything on your own takes enormous capital and energy. Now, if you've started a company from ground zero with no help from anybody, you know how much energy and capital that takes. I've seen churches that have started just kind of from the ground up, and with no no support, no encouragement for anybody else. Somebody says, I want to be a church, and so they become a church, and they get a couple people around them, and they try to build the church. And I know how hard and difficult that is. I know how, whenever you start with no help at all, and you try to do it on your own, that the difficulties and the obstacles seem insurmountable and difficult to overcome. So it makes sense to join God. It makes sense to join God in what He is doing, because He is the one that empowers us to overcome those difficulties in our life. Now, I've mentioned that I'm involved with some church work up in the Rhode Island area. Been involved with the planting of 2 churches, one that's gone very, very well and one that didn't go so well. And in a lot of it, you can see the independence of the one that didn't go so well, and how they really didn't take advantage of all the resources that they had. The other one has just done just the opposite. And this summer, I'm involved with a church called Renaissance Christian Church, which is meeting just outside Boston, Massachusetts. And they haven't even had a meeting yet. We have selected their team. It involves 3 couples from the Midwest who are literally going in there right now this month. They're establishing a base of operations, and they're going to continue working for the next year before they ever have their first meeting in developing relationships with people in Waltham, Massachusetts, which is just west of downtown Boston. It's the 3rd church that Christian churches have planted in Boston. The other 2 churches have done very well. And one of the reasons that they've done very well is because they are part of an organization called Restoration House Ministries. 20 years ago, Restoration House Ministries, under the vision of Danny Clymer, started a ministry in Manchester, Minnesota, and the idea was to plant churches so that the spiritual landscape of New England could be transformed. At that point, New England was the 2nd least churched place in America 20 years ago. And Christians were nowhere to be found at all. But now, and first 20 years ago was the Pacific Northwest, where I'm from. Now, New England has replaced the Pacific Northwest as the least churched area in the United States. And yet it is one of the most influential parts of our country. All of our economic systems and medical systems and so many things. There are universities all over the place, big universities. And so to have churches that are thriving and growing and pointing people to Jesus is so important to do. Very important to do. Add to that in New England over the last 20 years, you've had the scandal and the dismantling, literally, of the influence of the Catholic Church. You've got all these people just flooding out Catholic churches everywhere, and they don't know who to trust. And so when we come in there with our message that we are a Bible church, we are joining God in His mission to help close the gap between men and women and God. And we're not part of a big hierarchy, and we're not part of a big denomination. We're independent churches who love Jesus and are biblically motivated and guided. It has an opportunity to be a pretty successful thing. And in 20 years, there's been 16 to 18 churches that have been started. There were over 30,000 people in those churches on Easter Sunday. It's pretty amazing. All the way from Portland, Maine, where there's a church there that started about 10 years ago that had 2,500 people in church on Easter, and they've continued that 2,500 or so even now into the spring. I mean, they're just rocketing. To a church in Manchester, New Hampshire, which has 5,000 people coming to it, and they're spreading out into New Hampshire and Vermont. Churches in Providence and the churches in Boston, all of these churches doing great things. And so when we're looking to start churches now with Restoration House Ministries, we are doing it with the support of a team not only of ministers and oversight people like myself, but also counselors for the ministers that are kind of parachuting into this part of the world far from their families and everything else, and some very significant financial assets. For instance, Renaissance will start in June with their guys going into the field with over $1 million at their hand. Now, it all comes through churches that have supported them and churches that have lifted them up, and lots of individuals that have invested in them. And all of it is it's a picture of some people joining God in what He's already doing. And our goal is very simple. It is to transform the spiritual landscape of New England. And it is happening. It's really great. And the reason that I'm a part of it is because God's up to something in there. And I got invited into it, and I thought, well, why not? Let's see what happens. And I've been doing it now for 10 years and working with these churches. We have one church in Providence that actually, after 6 years, will install elders on Labor Day weekend. I actually will be up there to help them do that. And they will be completely self-supporting. And they'll have their own building and everything, and they're ready to go. And I think, man, that's a great way to work. And if you just knew how hard that is to have that happen in New England, you'd go, wow, for sure. Maybe I'll tell you more about that later. So, something significant is happening in New England. Well, something significant was happening in Jerusalem too. Only trouble was there wasn't anybody to lead it at all. And that's where we come here into Nehemiah chapter 1. Now, if you want to put a timeline to this, I think it was Saul that fell on his sword at about 1000 BC before Christ. So this Nehemiah story would be after the Babylonian captivity, after the Assyrians had run in and everything. There wasn't much left except a remnant of believers in Jerusalem. Most of them had been taken out and scattered all over the world. And that was the case about Nehemiah. God's people had been completely displaced from Jerusalem. And not only that, even with this small remnant there, they had destroyed the walls around Jerusalem, which made Jerusalem indefensible. You see, if you built a city in the 5th century BC, you had to have a wall around it, because if you didn't, then the marauders would just come in and run you over. The only thing that would stop them and allow you to prepare would be either for you to be on a really high tell of some sort where you could see them coming, or to have walls around them that they couldn't get through, or both. And Jerusalem didn't have any of that. Every city's power was in its walls. And the walls were so important. The walls were the protection of the local city, for sure. And so there was this mission that was going to go on now in the book of Nehemiah, and it was about rebuilding the walls. Look with me at Nehemiah chapter 1. We're just going to read the whole chapter here. It won't take very long at all. It says, the words of Nehemiah, the son of Hakaliah. So this is coming right from Nehemiah. In the month of Kislev, in the 20th year, while I was on the citadel of Susa, Hanani, one of my brothers, came from Judah with some other men, and I questioned them about the Jewish remnant that had survived the exile, and also about Jerusalem. And they said to me, those who survived the exile and are back in the province are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken, and its gates have been burned with fire. And when I heard these things, I sat down and wept. For some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. And then I said, Lord, the God of heaven, the great and awesome God who keeps his covenant of love with those who love him and keep his commandments, let your ear be attentive and your eyes open to hear the prayer of your servant is praying before you day and night, for your servants, the people of Israel. I confess the sins we Israelites, including myself and my father's family, have committed against you. We've acted very wickedly towards you. We have not obeyed the commands and decrees and the laws you gave your servant Moses. Remember the instruction you gave your servant Moses, saying that if you're unfaithful, I will scatter you among the nations. But if you return to me and obey my commands, then even if your exiled people are at the farthest horizons, I will gather them from there and will bring them to the place I have chosen as a dwelling for my name. They are your servants and your people, whom you redeemed by your great strength and your mighty hand. Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of this your servant and to the prayer of your servants who delight in revering your name. Give your servant success today by granting him favor in the presence of this man. I was a cupbearer to the king. So we get some clues about Nehemiah here a little bit. Number one, he was a praying man, and we know that, and we'll see that more through the study. Number two, he was the cupbearer to the king. So he was off in what is called Susa, which was 900 miles away from Jerusalem, and he was living in luxury as the cupbearer of the king. His only job was to taste the food and drink the wine before it got to the cupbearer, or got to the king, just in case somebody tried to assassinate the king. Now, that might seem like a little bit risky of a job, but I think they had protections in place. And really what it ended up being for Nehemiah is that he was kind of the king's right-hand man, okay, the trusted advisor right there at all times. And he'd been there for a while doing that. So not living in Jerusalem, though, disassociated himself from his own people. He was 900 miles away. And so even though he lived in luxury and had everything going for him, and it was probably the most and the best that any Jewish man could ever want in his life at that point, there was one problem. He wondered about what was going on with his people. That's where we see Nehemiah's concern. And we see it right out of the gate. It says there in verse 2, Hananiah, one of my brothers, came from Judah with some other men, and I questioned them. Now, have you ever asked somebody a question and then immediately as it left your mouth, you thought to yourself, I really wish I hadn't asked that question? You ever been there? Maybe because you know that maybe you're talking to somebody who's going to take you on a track far away from where you wanted to go. Or maybe you asked the question because you just wanted to look good to them, you already knew the answer. Or maybe you asked the question because you just wanted everybody else to think that you really cared even though you really didn't. I know that would never be any of us in any way, shape, or form. But for Nehemiah, he asked this question, how are my brothers doing? How is the Jewish remnant doing here? And so what we see is, from his response, that there is a genuine concern. And as the book unfolds, we see that Nehemiah was not casual about this question. He genuinely wanted to know what was going on in Jerusalem. And the answer was not encouraging. In verse 3, it says, those who survived the exile are back in the province, and they're in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates have been burned with fire. Now that would be simply the statement that would say they have no protection, they have no real culture at all, they've been completely overrun. And the conditions were deplorable, they were terrible, terribly bad. They had no protection around the city, they were among disgrace among the other nations in the land. This was not what God intended for his people, for sure. Now, this had been the condition from 450, this had been the condition of the Jewish remnant for 140 years. So we are talking about generation now after generation after generation has been dealing with this terrible disgrace going on. His question and their answer brings up an important question and answer for any church that wants to boldly lead the way in 2018. And that is this. Are we so comfortable in here that we don't know what's going on out there? Are we so comfortable in here, and have we built our life with a cocoon around us full of our Christian friends and our community groups and our classes and our activities and our camps and our once-in-a-while fellowship kind of things and Sunday every service, that we wrap up all our life in our church family and have no idea what's going on in the world around us? You see, a lot of times we can be that way unless we are courageous enough to ask the question of somebody who would know. What is going on out there? What are the troubles and the pains and the sorrows of people that we don't really come in contact to because we've built our life the way we've built our life? Nehemiah took a chance and asked the question. The fact is that we don't have to go 900 miles to find out that there are people that are hurting, do we? I've made a couple drives through Oklahoma City. I'm trying to get my bearings on where everything is, and I've got it down to northwest, northeast, southwest, southeast, and trying to figure out, without really paying a lot of attention to a lot of people who have their own ideas about where everything is, drive through some of these areas and see where the poverty is and see where the pain is and see where the sorrow is and that kind of thing. And it's been interesting. There's poverty and there's pain and there's sorrow in all four quadrants. It's pretty interesting. And there are pockets where there doesn't look to be anything on the surface, but then you know as well as I do that behind the walls and behind the nice houses and everything, there may be just as much pain and sorrow in those areas as anywhere else. But it's pretty easy to wall ourselves off. and never ask the question. And then when pain enters into our world, we're shocked and we're dismayed because it never really occurs to us that that's the way our world is. I mean, who would imagine going to dinner on Lake Hefner and somehow being involved in a gunfight on a Friday afternoon at 6:30? I mean, when I read that and I saw that and how that happened, I thought, that's right by our house. That just shouldn't happen here. That should happen wherever there is, but not here where I am at all. And yet it does. We don't even think about it. So when we isolate ourselves, one of the things that we have to do is we have to ask ourselves a question, and that is, am I willing to ask the question of others about their pain and their sorrow? And if I'm willing to ask the question, then this is the deal. You have to be willing to hear the answer. And Nehemiah was. Nehemiah asked the question. They said those who survived are in terrible shape. He heard the answer. And then he didn't say in verse 3, at the end of 3, then I went on back to doing what I was doing, being the cupbearer of the king and living in luxury for the rest of my life. Instead, in verse 4, the question with the answer wrecked Nehemiah's heart. It just wrecked him. Have you ever been wrecked by anything? I mean, really wrecked? Not by a car or something like that, but by a situation that ought not to be. It ought not to be. Pam and I were taking the kids on a trip once. We took them to Flagstaff and to Yellowstone, or to Grand Canyon. I had built it up because I'd grown up going to Grand Canyon all my times growing up, and it was pretty cool. It was on our way to Grandma's house, so we go see it. And I told my kids, "You are going to love Grand Canyon so much. It's going to be the greatest thing ever, better than anything you can imagine." And I knew, kind of rolling around, especially in Joel and Elizabeth's eyes, was like, "What is he taking us to now?" You know. Well, when we got to Flagstaff, it was snowing. Spring break. It was snowing. What kind of world do we live in? It was snowing in Arizona. And it snowed, and it snowed, and it snowed, and it snowed. So much so they said, you ought not to take the road up to Grand Canyon. And I remember thinking and saying to a couple of people, I drove all the way from Tulsa, Oklahoma to see that canyon and have my kids see that canyon. We're going to see that canyon when we're there. Well, I wouldn't go today. I'd try tomorrow. Okay, so we're stuck in a hotel room watching TV when news flash goes through, breaking news. And it was all the news about the Jonesboro shooting that had happened years ago, where a couple kids had shot kids in school from outside the school grounds. And I will tell you that, and Pam probably, she can remember this, I just sat there and cried. I just thought, who would do this? I mean, it wrecked me. It just wrecked my heart. And I struggled with that the rest of the trip. Who would do something like that? Why do things happen like that? I also had to wrestle with the fact that when we got up to the Grand Canyon that morning, the next morning, that the entire canyon was fogged in. Which was quite an impressive feat, that I could take my kids all the way to Arizona to a fogged-in Grand Canyon that looked great. And all of a sudden, in just one moment, the fog lifted, and when it lifted, I was watching. It lifted, and I yelled at the kids, and I said, there, look at it. And they did, and then the fog went down, and we got in the car, literally, and we drove home. That was our trip to Grand Canyon. So I was wrecked on 2 or 3 emotional levels at that point. The kids didn't think this was that great of an idea. We did get to go see their uncle and different stuff like that. But for me, it was all about Grand Canyon. But all the way back, even back on the trip, I kept wrestling with this idea of somebody shooting kids in a school. Now in 2018, it seems like it happens all the time. And yet it still should wreck our hearts, shouldn't it? It should still break our hearts when these things happen. Nehemiah had a concern, and he asked a question, and when he got the answer, it wrecked him. It says there, when I heard these things in verse 4, I sat down and wept. When's the last time you just sat down and wept for something you had no control over? It just broke your heart. It says that for some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven? When has your life just stopped because of the injustice in this world and the pain in this world? And you've said, I can't go on just doing what I'm doing. I've got to do something else. That's what was happening to Nehemiah here. And Nehemiah's got that response, which we read in verse 4. He sat down and wept, and he kept weeping, and he mourned, and he fasted, and he prayed. When's the last time that you really were broken because of the condition of your community, here in this community? When's the last time that you saw something in your family or in your church or in your neighborhood, in the city, in the state, in the country, in the world that caused you just to stop? And I'm not talking just about Lake Hefner shootings or shootings in Indiana and Texas and Florida and all the school things, or that shooting in the church in Texas last year and the shooting in Las Vegas and the shootings in Toronto. You know, there is a lot of terrifically bad things happening in this world that never make the news. And you hear the stories. So Nehemiah was moved in his heart, and because of that, he set out on a course, and this is what we're going to study the rest of the month. How do we prepare ourselves to see what the mission is that God is inviting us into? Okay, what is God inviting us into? The first thing that we have to do is we have to set aside our own understanding. We have to set aside our own understanding. I think we tend to live our lives under the umbrella of how we feel like it's going to unfold in our lives. And I was thinking about this in relationship to my parents and being out in Oregon this week and just seeing some things that didn't look exactly right. And I was thinking, you know what? Every day is a new day, and every day's got a surprise. I don't know how many times this last week I found myself saying to either my mom or my dad, or more importantly, even to myself, I had no idea. And when you live 2,500 miles away and you're kind of the chief caregiver and over all of that, you know, I just kept thinking, I got to get out here more to see what's going on, because things happen. We tend to live our lives in this way that we expect that everything will unfold the way we want it to. But there are times for us where God tells us to take a right turn or to go back or to make a move that doesn't make any sense to anybody else. And all of a sudden, in those moments, we're left not with our own understanding, but with God's. That's why Proverbs 3, 5, and 6 says, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your path straight. Now that's a promise no matter what kind of circumstance you find yourself your life in. It's a promise that's true. That if you lean only on your own understanding instead of giving it to God and saying, God, I'll deal with whatever is coming because I trust you. If you lean only on your own understanding, you're going to find yourself up against roadblocks. You're going to find yourself up against deep depression and deep difficulty in your soul. You're going to really wonder and question God. In all your ways, he says, in all your ways, acknowledge him. Make sure that God's at the center of every decision that you make. And all it says there is that he'll make your paths straight. He'll make your paths straight. Will they be bumpy? Yeah, they probably will be. And they may be straight for a while with a little curve here and there, but you know that he will guide you where you need to go. But the most important thing is that bold leadership always begins with a heart that's in the right place. A heart that is depending upon God. So many people think, well, God doesn't listen to me and he doesn't tell me what to do, and it's not like giving me orders, marching orders, and that kind of thing. And there are a lot of times we feel really alone in this world. But let me tell you something. A lot of times we don't hear from God because we have our lives so fully mapped out in our own mind that there's no real way for God to enter in. And he's really not about just blowing up lives in order to get his way, but I think what he's calling us to do, and what we see in Nehemiah is that there was enough room in Nehemiah's heart that when God put something on his heart, it could get through. Is that true for you? Or is your heart so cluttered and so busy and so overwhelmed with your plans and your desires that you can't set aside your own understanding and lean into his no matter where that takes you? I think about a friend of mine. I knew him in college. I haven't really talked to him since. But he's been a minister in Oklahoma, been a minister a long time in North Carolina. And this year, just out of the blue, he decided to pack up his wife and move to Nairobi, Kenya. He's 60 years old. Now, I'm almost 60 years old, and I tell you what, just reading the sentence makes me tired. To move to Nairobi, Kenya. And he has become the pastor of a church in Nairobi, Kenya, and he is leading an organization of churches that are specifically designed to go into the poorest of the poor in Kenya and try to help those people and lift them up. And he's 60 years old. There is no way I could even fathom that in my own mind. But there was enough room in Craig's heart for God to get in there and speak something to him. And I think that's the way we should all live, no matter whether we're 30 or 60 or 80. We ought to leave some room in our hearts so that God can speak to us. And if you're the one that's sitting there saying, God never speaks to me and never directs me, maybe it's because your heart is too full of all of your stuff, not because of his. And so we have to have this big idea as we understand Nehemiah, that as long as your understanding is the standard of your life, you'll never be available to join him in his work. As long as it's all about your understanding and not his, you'll never be available to join him in his work. And I'm challenged by this book, and I've studied this and preached this a lot over the years. I am challenged because the first thing that he says coming out of the gate in Nehemiah 1 is, put aside your comfort and your plans and listen to me. Listen to me. I got a plan for you. And God does. This is what you've done. You started ministries in apartments to kids. That was somebody who had enough room in their heart to let God speak to them. We have had ladies who have started food pantries and continue that for the last 5 years. Those are people who had room in their hearts and let God speak to them. And now they feed dozens and dozens of people every Tuesday. People that depend on that food because somebody is listening to God. It's what you do when you say yes to helping kids in church or in Sunday school. It's what you do when you do the crazy thing and say, yes, I'll go to junior high camp with the kids. And you think, oh, what have I just done? And you think, well, you know what? You give God a little bit of room, he's going to speak to you. And you're going to be in for the ride of your lifetime. It's what you do when you take every Wednesday morning and you go over to Rollingwood and you help teachers with copying and doing all that stuff that you ladies have done. And you have no idea what kind of impact that has had on those teachers and kids in Rollingwood Elementary School. And you know how that happened? It happened because you had a piece of your heart that was available to God. And God said, yeah, I got something you can get up to. Here's something you can do. So, if you're the kind of person that says, I've got my life figured out and I know exactly where it's going, could I just encourage you, stop it. Slow down. Take it a little bit easier. And instead of always thinking, I've got my life planned out how I want it, spend some time saying to God, God, what do you want for my life? Now, if you're not ready for the answer, don't ask the question. You know how that goes. Because he throws something out there and then all of a sudden you go, that was not what I was up for at all. And I get that. But what he does in Nehemiah 1 is he asks the question and he's ready for the answer. And then he prays. He prays, O Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of this your servant and to the prayer of your servants who delight in revering your name. He was praying for his people. It's not a one-day prayer. Matter of fact, if you knew Hebrew calendar, which I don't, people tell me this stuff, but this from Nehemiah 1 to Nehemiah 2 was 4 months. 4 months every day praying over and over and over again. So when we're called into God's mission, we have to be patient. And we have to understand that all the details will not come into focus immediately. This is what I call step-by-step living. And if you are honest with your life, you know that that's the way you've lived your life. You may think you've got it all figured out, but things happen, detours, all kinds of other things, and you end up getting lost along the way. Our son-in-law, James, went with me to Oregon this week on Tuesday, and he went because my dad sold him his pickup. Now, this pickup was a Toyota Tacoma. It was a 2001, so it's 17 years old. It had 33,000 miles on it. Okay, so obviously Dad had pretty much only driven around the block to his friend and done a couple things. It was in great shape. And so Dad, we started talking when we got out there, and my dad told James, said, now you should only drive 8 hours a day. And I looked at James, and James looked at me, and I thought, Dad, there is no way that's going to happen. If that was me, it wouldn't happen. And so he got in the car like on Wednesday morning at 5 till 5 in the morning, and he drove all the way to central Wyoming. It took him about 16 hours. My dad worried about that because my dad had a plan. Oh, if he makes it to Boise, he's going to be lucky. Well, he made it to double Boise, basically, because that's what he does. And then when I told my dad that, I said, Dad, he's going to make this trip in 2 days. Oh, no, he's not. He can't. There's no way he can do that. No way that can ever happen. Dad, that's what's going to happen. And so I had kind of planned it out and thought I knew where he would be in Kansas sometime in the middle of the next day. And then I got this text from him. He said, hey, I decided to make a detour. And he went back into the Colorado mountains to a camp where we have camps at to visit with a couple of people, 4 hours out of his way. And he still made the trip in 2 days. That's crazy, isn't it? And if I'd have made that trip with him in 2 days, Jake would be preaching this morning, okay? For sure. Couldn't do that. But my dad had it in his mind, this is exactly how it's going, and he couldn't get it out of his mind. And he reminded me that I'm a lot that way with God. This is exactly how I think it's all going to unfold, but it doesn't always unfold that way. There are all kinds of other circumstances. All we know to do is to take the next step, whatever the next step is. Nehemiah didn't know really what was before him. All we know is that he was going to move out of chapter 1 after praying for 4 months now to going before his king to seek permission to go to Jerusalem. And he had no idea how that was going to go at all. And so his last prayer is, give your servant success. I think this is the next step. And then you could go from there. Well, last week I talked about this a little bit. I'm going to bring it back this week, talk about growing up on lakes and about how you run around lakes all the time. But my dad had this really cool way of shifting it down into neutral, and we would just glide into the shore. And I always loved that moment when it was quiet, no engine or anything in the water, was just cruising in. And I think about that's how a lot of us think when we get to be my age or older, that I'm just going to cruise right in. Well, Nehemiah took on something where there was no cruising. And this is going to be a bigger job than he could ever imagine. But it was the job that God had called him to join him in. And he was going to help rebuild the wall in Jerusalem, which was going to play a significant part in the life of Israel. Nehemiah was a leader. He was a man of action. He was bold. He was a man that people looked to and followed. He was a man that was not going to cruise into the end of his life, but he was going to fight for this mission that God had given him. So what about you? What is it that you have all figured out and that God has no place in your life? In other words, as I said earlier, is there any room, no matter how old you are, is there any room in your heart for God to wiggle in there and to redirect you into some kind of mission that he wants to do with you? Anything. Because that's really what a follower does, is he opens his heart to God and understands that every single day is a gift from God, and that when God calls, we should be ready to go. Why don't you stand if you would, please? Bow your heads with me. Our Father, as we start on this journey with Nehemiah, we're going to see the challenges that come when we say yes to you. May it never be said that saying yes to you and your mission means that it's all going to be smooth and easy. The only thing we know is that the best place we could ever be is in the middle of your will, joining you in your mission to change this world. I think about those churches in New England, many of them doing very hard work, but doing really great work. And many of those church planters that have come in from the Midwest and where they were surrounded by large churches and large families and everything else. And I know that many of them have suffered over the years from loneliness and from a field that was really hard, and there were lots of rocks and lots of obstacles and a lot of people who didn't really want the church to take root in New England. And yet, God, you have said it is so vital and so important that the church take root in this part of the United States. And thank you, God, that there are bold men and women and children. There have been for 20 plus years. And bold churches like ours and others who have invested in the work that you have called us into. And I pray, Father, that commitment to that work would not just be thousands of miles away, but it would be even in our community. That it be in our school for those who are teachers and those who work as aides in school, that they would see their job not just as busy work or as stuff to do to make a check, but they would see that as part of your mission. I think about how we have opportunities to reach into the lives of people in some of the most nondescript ways, but just open up to them that there is a different way to live. I think about coffee shops, and I think about preschools, and I think about the events of the church, and I think about how moms and dads rub shoulders with other moms and dads and have little tiny opportunities to say there's a different way. And when the questions are asked, may we be men and women who are willing to take the answer and then take you, God, take you up on the offer to join you in your mission. May this be a summer of clarity for us as a church. May there be missions that are completed, but also may there be missions that are started and ignited as we study and as we reflect, God, on giving you enough room in our heart to speak to us. And I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.